Sony designed MiniDisc to replace the compact cassette recorder. The MZ1 brought that idea to market in 1992. A small digital recorder built around a disc protected by a cartridge. MiniDisc went on to have two very different stories. In 1993, Sony told investors that the format had been well received worldwide. Later reports describe a much less even result. It became popular in Japan, but never entered the mainstream in the United States or the wider West. The difficulties changed as the years passed. The American machines arrived at high prices, and the selection of pre-recorded music was limited. CDR and MP3 players later changed the competition. Sony eventually connected MiniDisc to computers through NetMD, but that system placed controls on how music could be transferred. MiniDisc was useful, distinctive, and long-lived. Its market history simply never matched the scale of Sony's original ambition. The disc was 64 millimeters across and sat inside a protective cartridge. Sony and IEEE descriptions list digital recording and playback, direct access to recordings, editing, and buffer memory that protected portable listening from skips. For somebody used to tape, this promised a different experience. Finding a recording did not require winding through a cassette. Editing was built into the format. The cartridge protected the disc, while the buffer helped keep the music playing on the move. What mattered was the combination. MiniDisc could play music, capture it, and let users edit what they had captured. Random access removed the need to wind through a tape, while the cartridge and buffer supported portable use. Sony was asking listeners to replace cassette with a format built around those differences. Sony's goal was clear. MiniDisc was designed to replace the compact cassette recorder. The MZ1 put that idea into a commercial product in 1992. It was a serious attempt to improve portable recording, not simply an unusual side project. The challenge was turning that design into a mass-market habit outside Japan. In the United States, MiniDisc made an expensive first impression. The BBC reported that the recorder cost $750 when it launched there in December 1992. Even the playback-only model was $549. Fewer than 50,000 units were sold in the following year, according to the same report. Those figures belong to the American launch, not the whole world. They still show how much commitment the first machines demanded from somebody considering a move away from cassette. Contemporary and later accounts cite the high hardware price as one barrier to adoption. Sony kept trying. It cut recorder prices and relaunched MiniDisc in the United States more than once, adjusting the offer as the format developed. The price cuts show how much the American offer changed after launch. Sony kept returning to the market rather than treating the first year's response as the final answer. MiniDisc was not launched and immediately abandoned, but every new attempt followed an opening in which the hardware was costly and American sales were low. The player was only half the proposition. A new music format also needed a range of music to support it, and reports from the time and afterward describe MiniDisc's pre-recorded catalog as limited. There were pre-recorded MiniDisc releases, and Sony was not the only label behind them. The problem was the size of the selection. It became another barrier, alongside the high price of the early hardware. MiniDisc could capture and edit audio, yet the expensive machines and narrow catalog made the early offer harder to establish. Price and selection shaped the opening chapter before newer competitors entered the picture. Sony sounded confident in 1993. Its message to investors was that MiniDisc had been well received worldwide. That was the company's view near the start of the format's life. Later reporting says MiniDisc became popular in Japan, while never becoming mainstream in the United States or the wider West. Sony was describing the early reception. Those later accounts had a much longer story to judge. Japan stops MiniDisc from being dismissed as a product nobody wanted. It found popularity there. At the same time, that success did not carry into the Western markets, where MiniDisc remained outside the mainstream. MiniDisc was not a worldwide triumph or a worldwide rejection. It was one format with sharply different outcomes. By 2001, NetMD had given MiniDisc a link to the personal computer. Sony's instructions show that the connection came with rules about how music could move. Before transfer, the software changed files into an encrypted Sony format called a Track 3. Sony called its transfer controls check-in and check-out and restricted parts of the process to the same computer. For the listener, the computer connection came with encryption and limits on where transfers could happen. NetMD arrived years after the expensive launch and the reports of limited pre-recorded support. By then, CDR and MP3 players had also become competitors. MiniDisc was no longer fighting the same battle it had faced in 1992. The computer link opened another route into the format, but it asked users to follow Sony's transfer rules along the way. MiniDisc's problems did not all arrive together. Price and the limited catalogue belonged to its early years. Sony responded with price cuts and American relaunches. CDR and MP3 players came later, as did NetMD and its computer transfer rules. Taken together, it looks less like one decisive defeat and more like a series of hurdles. We cannot say which mattered most. Japan's popularity also warns against blaming the technology alone. Missing the Western mainstream did not make MiniDisc useless. BBC analyst Chris Green said the format kept a place among sound engineers and media professionals, including people recording interviews, samples, and jingles. That was a smaller role than Sony's cassette replacement ambition, but it was a real one. Interviews, samples, and jingles were practical recording jobs suited to MiniDisc's recording and editing design. The format continued to serve those professional niches after its wider Western hopes had narrowed. The hardware also disappeared in stages. Sony stopped shipping MiniDisc Walkman players in 2011. Production of its last MiniDisc stereo system ended in 2013. Different parts of the product line reached their end at different times. MiniDisc had moved away from the mass-market future Sony once imagined, yet it still had jobs to do. The final announced step came much later. In January 2025, Sony said it would end production of recordable MiniDisc and MD data media the following month. That announcement followed the end of Walkman shipments in 2011 and the last stereo system production in 2013. Each date covered a different part of MiniDisc, so the format did not disappear on a single day. Picture the ending not as a chart, but as the object itself. A 64mm disc safe inside a protective cartridge. Sony introduced MiniDisc in 1992 with the intention of replacing the cassette recorder. In January 2025, it announced the end of recordable MiniDisc and MD data media production. By the time of that announcement, MiniDisc was no longer only Sony's proposed cassette replacement. It had become popular in Japan, and as BBC analyst Chris Green described, retained niches among sound engineers and media professionals. In the United States and wider West, it never became the mainstream cassette replacement. The small disc in its cartridge had taken a much longer route than Sony first imagined.